Hello, so today's video is going to be about a perfumer who's had some absolutely ginormous designer hits. She's someone who has created fragrances for Givenchy, such as L'Interdit, and who's had a worldwide hit with YSL's Libre. She's also someone who understandably lists orange blossom as her favourite scent. Yes, it's Anne Flipo. So if you've not seen me before, I'm Claire, and I've been creating a series of videos all about the lives and creations of perfumers. I've already created 10 videos in this series, so if you do want to catch up, I'll leave all of those videos down in the description box below. But for today's video, we'll be talking about Anne Flipo. So Anne Flipo was born in 1961 in the north of France, in the Pas-de-Calais, in Picardy. And her family were a farming family, so they mainly focused on sugar beet, but she grew up surrounded by wheat fields and by fields of flowers. From an early age, she's said to have developed a keen sense of smell, and she says that she really remembers the scent that her grandmother used in particular. So her grandmother wore L'Heure Bleue by Guerlain, and that is really a kind of representation of twilight, of that time in the evening when the dark's coming down. It's a very powdery iris fragrance. She also says that she was influenced by the presence of American perfumery when she was little. So her mum and her aunt would wear fragrances by Estee Lauder, so particularly Estee and also Youth Dew. And her sister would wear Alliage and Cinnabar by Estee Lauder and also Revlon's Charlie. At the age of 13, Flipo encountered the scent of orange blossom. She found some orange blossom in a friend's courtyard and she was captivated by it. This very complex floral would become her signature note in fragrances, and she would use it over and over alongside neroli, alongside petitgrain and alongside green notes to create her compositions. After passing her school exams, she decided that she wanted to study chemistry, first in Lille and then in Paris. She initially focused on organic chemistry, but she soon found her calling in the world of perfumery. Much against her parents' advice, they wanted her to go into engineering. She applied to perfumery school in Versailles. She applied for an apprenticeship with Roure. At Roure, she began to learn about ingredients and also about compositions. She was trained by the best. So she was trained by the perfumer who developed opium, Jean-Louis Siuzac, and also Jean Curliot, who is the person who was responsible for setting up the Osmothèque in Versailles, and also Michel Amirac of Gucci Rush fame. She initially honed her skills by working for companies that really concentrated on fragrance ingredients. So she worked for Deleuze, she worked for Florissant, and she also worked for Création Aromatique. Finally, in 1988, she joined the company Quest. So Quest would later be bought by Givaudan in 2007, but at the time they were an independent company. Flipo says of her early career that she was initially met with disbelief that a woman could be a perfumer or want to be a perfumer. She says she was only inspired to keep going by people like Sophia Grossman, trailblazers in the world of perfumery. And that was really what kept her on the path to becoming a perfumer. So having investigated Anne Flipo's early fragrances, I've really struggled to come up with the one that I think is her earliest creation. And actually there are a few fragrances dotted around in the 80s, but they're few and far between, and I think they're mostly discontinued. Really, her fragrance catalogue develops more in the early 90s, so we're going to pick it up there. So her first success really is for the brand Artisan Perfumer. Her first creation for the brand was called Mimosa pour moi. And yes, it's a mimosa fragrance. It's supposedly green, powdery, sunny and bright mimosa. So that fragrance launched in 1992 and she went on to create another 5 fragrances for the brand, including another one that featured mimosa. And she also featured mimosa in her creation for Chloe, in Fleur de Narcisse, a Narcissus fragrance launched in 1994. Flipo continued working for Quest and she gained contracts for brands such as Rochus, such as Lolita Lempicka and also Yves Rocher. However, her wider commercial success really developed after she joined International Flavours and Fragrances, IFF, in 2004. It was at IFF that she worked extensively with Dominique Ropion. And firstly, they created together the now much sought after powdery almond and violet fragrance, My Queen by Alexander McQueen. Only a year later, the pair really experienced their first taste of commercial success as a partnership, and they launched a new fragrance line, a new male marketed fragrance line for YSL. It was called Homme. This crisp, spiced, aromatic fragrance spawned a whole other line of fragrances as well as numerous flanker fragrances, and it really elevated the demand for Flipo's work. In 2009, La Nuit de l'Homme really just took the market by storm, and Flipo would work on most, if not all, of the subsequent flankers for that fragrance. You will see again and again in the initial period of Anne Flipo's career, she will work again and again with Ropion in partnership on some really big and important fragrances. So again in 2010, Flipo worked with Ropion to launch a new fragrance for Giorgio Armani. This time it was Aqua de Jour, a fresh lemon, minty and aquatic fragrance, which was really launched as a bit of a challenger to Dolce & Gabbana's Light Blue. At the time, Dolce & Gabbana's Light Blue was one of the best-selling designer fragrances on the market, at least in the US. Also in 2010, Anne Flipo helped to launch a new fragrance for Paco Rabanne. So this was meant to be a female-marketed version of the already very successful 1 Million line. And this fragrance really did just nail the brief. It smelt gold. It was a raspberry and neroli and orange blossom, her favourite notes, alongside a honey and an amber. Really the most golden smelling fragrance I can think of. It was absolutely everywhere in the UK and in the early 2010s. It was very, very popular. It was loud, it was bright and it was gold, and it fitted very well with the style at the time in the early 2010s. In 2011, Flipo formulated a much-loved fragrance for Lancôme. She formulated a Trésor flanker called Midnight Rose. I think this one might be disappearing or might actually be discontinued, I'm not sure. But this one is really a dark, fruity rose fragrance. And I think it's a fragrance that's looked upon very fondly, much more fondly than a fragrance that she would develop only a year later, alongside Ropion again and also Olivier Polge. So this was La Vie Est Belle, and it's much maligned now, but at the time, it was a huge launch for Lancôme and it was a worldwide bestseller. This fragrance was clearly inspired by the idea of the patchouli and the idea of the very sweet ethyl maltol kind of cotton candy note. This fragrance took the dosage of the ethyl maltol into the extreme. This was many times more than the amounts that had been used in fragrances such as Flower Bomb. La Vie Est Belle also contained iris concrete, and it was meant to convey a sensuality alongside a strength. If you smell La Vie Est Belle nowadays, it's really not the fragrance that it was 14 years ago. I feel like it's been toned down a little bit, and it just doesn't have quite the punch that it once did. But it still is a worldwide best-selling fragrance, and it's still spawning flankers today. Flipo has developed many of the flankers that have been marketed, and my favourite of the flankers of La Vie Est Belle is actually La Vie Est Belle L'Éclat. So this, ironically, is an orange blossom version of La Vie Est Belle, and of course Flipo is famous for her orange blossom fragrances. So La Vie Est Belle was not a simple fragrance to develop. They actually did over 60,000 trials of over 5,000 different formulations, and it took over 3 years to develop. But clearly those 3 years of development must have paid off, because Lancôme are still launching flankers 14 years later with this line. So it must be still incredibly successful to still be in Lancôme's catalogue. On the back of the success of the Nuit de l'Homme line by YSL, Flipo was tasked with developing a new fragrance, a new female marketed fragrance for YSL. She again worked with Loc Dong and this time developed the fragrance Manifesto. We were really in the 2010s when vanilla was becoming more and more prominent in perfumery. There were just lots of fruity vanilla fragrances out there, and Manifesto took blackcurrant and combined it with vanilla and sandalwood to give a sensual feeling vanilla. In 2014, Flipo worked on a new fragrance for Chloe, and this one was called Love Story. So Love Story came in a very particular padlock-shaped bottle. And this bottle was inspired by love locks that were being left on a particular bridge in Paris. This was all over the news at the time, and I think eventually they ended up cutting the padlocks off the bridge to save it because it was in danger of collapse because of the weight of the locks. But the idea behind this fragrance really was something very romantic. And it was in a very typical Chloe style, very light, very airy. So this was a neroli and orange blossom fragrance. Of course, it's Anne Flipo's favourite notes. And it was just in a very fresh, clean style with a bit of a sparkly fruitiness as well. It seemed to be a fragrance that didn't do too well for Chloe, and I think the lasting power of that fragrance may have had something to do with that. But I actually really liked Love Story, and I'm sad that one's gone. So also in 2014, Anne Flipo also worked on a fragrance for Lolita and Pica called Sweet, which I did used to own. It's got a lollipop style cherry to it, alongside a really textured feeling cocoa, musk and sugar. The cocoa here really is just an impression of a rich powderiness. It's not chocolatey. And I think this fragrance was just a little bit strange for me, and I ended up decluttering it. I don't think this was anywhere near the success of the original fragrance, but it did spawn a flanker, and I do still see it for sale. So that's Sweet by Lolita and Pica. So 2015 saw more very big launches for Anne Flipo. So she had developed, again, a new fragrance for Paco Rabanne. This time it was Olympea. So Olympea was a fragrance that was a salty vanilla fragrance. And that was really in vogue at the time because salted caramel desserts, salted caramel chocolate, it was a whole trend around 2015. And that fragrance really capitalised on that food trend by translating it into a scent. Also that year, Anne Flipo developed a new fragrance line for Jimmy Choo. And I feel like this one was only really talked about when the fragrance itself became discontinued and it went to discounters. You could pick up a bottle of Jimmy Choo's illicit for as little as £30 for 100ml at one point. And I think lots of people cottoned on to the fact that this fragrance was actually pretty good. It was a golden feeling, gingery, citrus, floral amber. I actually owned the flanker of this one. I owned Illicit Flower, but I did also really like Illicit. So 2016 saw Flipo develop a set of 5 fragrances for Jo Malone. These were part of an overall collection that were based around the idea of being in a herb garden. I didn't ever get to try any of these 5 fragrances, but I think the most popular one was one called Wild Strawberry and Parsley. They sound really interesting, but I don't know whether they were special editions for Jo Malone. If you tried any of the herb garden scents, then please do let me know what you thought of them. This same year, 2016, Flipo also formulated a fragrance for Coach. So Coach were relaunching their fragrance brand, and they basically updated a fragrance that already existed and created a brand new fragrance with the same name. So this is Coach EDP, and this is one of my favourite fragrances to wear to work. So this is a really fresh feeling, sparkly raspberry and rose fragrance, and it has a very mild, suede-y, musky dry down. Really, the flankers have almost outshone the original fragrance, but this one is still my favourite. So it's Coach EDP. So in 2017, Flipo actually formulated 2 designer fragrances that I used to own. So the first of these was Emporio Armani's Because It's You. So I did actually finish a bottle of this one, and I did like it to begin with, but I feel like this fragrance had a very awkward juxtaposition of notes that were really sharp and other notes that were really sweet. And that created something that just didn't feel quite in balance. So it had lemon and neroli, but it also had raspberry, rose and vanilla. And they seemed to be almost fighting against each other. The other fragrance that she formulated that year was Ralph Lauren's Woman. So I also used to own this one, and I ended up decluttering this because it just didn't feel like me. But it's a very distinctive fragrance. So it has a very light feeling tuberose and orange blossom, but there's also some texture from some hazelnut, and then there's some bitterness there as well. So it's got a bit of a sparkly blackcurrant, but there's also some bitterness from some rhubarb, which makes her a very odd combination. So moving on to 2018, that was again a big successful year for Flipo, and she worked again with Ropion and this time also with Fanny Bal, and she developed a new fragrance for Givenchy based on their original bestseller L'Interdit. So Givenchy wanted to relaunch L'Interdit, the fragrance that they had originally formulated, as the legend goes, for Audrey Hepburn. And they launched a fragrance based around orange blossom and also tuberose. So this fragrance was meant to be the idea of an underground flower and to have both white notes, so the white florals, alongside darker feeling notes, so the vetiver and the patchouli. And this fragrance, when they launched it, they shot the advertising campaign on the Paris Metro, which really gave it a very retro Audrey Hepburn kind of feel, and also gave you the idea of something underground and perhaps something illicit. Of course, we've had lots of success from the L'Interdit line, and I think the two biggest hits from this line have been the Intense, so the black version with the sesame note, but also the Rouge version. So that's the version that I actually own, and that is a spiced version almost of L'Interdit. So it's got some pimiento and some ginger, and it also has a really creamy feeling sandalwood in the base alongside quite a lot of vanilla, which isn't listed, but there's definitely a lot of vanilla in L'Interdit Rouge. So in 2019, Flipo had again an enormous hit with YSL. This time she was working with Carlos Benaïm, and she worked to develop a fragrance with the codename Boyish. So this fragrance had the codename Boyish because it was a fougere fragrance. It was based around lavender and musks. So she combined this fougere with a lot of orange blossom and also a ton of vanilla. And this fragrance was finally launched as Libre. So Libre was said to have taken over 7 years and 1,570 trials to perfect. I do feel like Libre was a really big success for YSL, and it's been a bestseller consistently. I think also a big part of the success was the advertising campaign and also the bottle. The bottle is iconic, and I've even seen people smashing up the bottle when they finish their fragrance and tearing the YSL logo off and using the YSL logo as a badge, because YSL actually sell the YSL logo as a separate piece of jewellery that you can buy for hundreds of pounds, which I thought was quite inventive. So of course now we've had loads of Libre flankers, including the Intense and the Parfum, which I think did particularly well for YSL. And then more recently we've had Berry Crush. I think Libre is a fragrance line that will just keep going. I can't see that one stopping anytime soon. So in 2020, it wasn't a great year to launch fragrances, was it? But Givenchy approached Flipo and she developed a new fragrance for the Irresistible line. So this fragrance was quite a light feeling pear and rose musk. And I don't think it made too much of an impression on the market, but that may have been because of the timing of its release. I feel as if the flankers of that fragrance have subsequently done better. Also that year, Flipo developed her first fragrance for Van Cleef & Arpels. This was Oud Blanc. So Oud Blanc is often compared with Oud Bouquet by Lancôme, so it's a vanilla and oud fragrance combined with some rose. So in 2021, Flipo was asked by Frederic Malle to develop a fragrance for his line. So at the time, Estée Lauder were in charge, but he hadn't yet relinquished directorship. And Flipo really loves green notes, as well as petitgrain, orange blossom, and also neroli. Green notes are her real love, and she took green notes to the extreme in a fragrance called Synthetic Jungle initially, which was then later renamed to Synthetic Nature. And we can only guess why this fragrance was renamed. Maybe there was some kind of copyright infringement, maybe there was some concerns around use of the word jungle. I'm really not sure why they would rename the fragrance, but this fragrance is a really green feeling composition. It has basil and it also has some very green but powdery florals in them, so things like hyacinth and also lily of the valley, but they feel very, very green overall. It's a fragrance that I personally don't love. I remember the first time I tried it and I was quite shocked by how it smelt. But I do think this fragrance really fits with the rest of the Frederic Malle line. It is a very distinctive, very interesting composition, and I do think this one's been popular. In 2022 came one of Flipo's few flops, and this was a new fragrance launch, an entire new line for Viktor and Rolf. So this fragrance was called Good Fortune, and it was marketed in a bottle that looked like a crystal ball. I remember when this first came out, I was so excited to try it, and once I got a sample, I was immediately disappointed. This was a jasmine fragrance, but it was also a very textured vanilla, and there was gentian and also fennel listed. And those together gave this an almost bitter feeling, but it wasn't quite bitter. It was still very sweet, but it was just a texture for me that I really didn't get on with that fragrance. And I felt the same thing when I tried Angel Elixir from Mugler. And those two fragrances, they're both by Anne Flipo. And that fragrance was launched in 2023, just a year later after Good Fortune. So in 2024, Flipo actually formulated some of the legacy collection for Estée Lauder. And this was kind of as a little bit of a swan song for Frederic Malle, who at the time was the curator of the line and was asking particular perfumers to perfect particular fragrances in the line. These fragrances were all based on original creations by Estée Lauder. They were priced very much higher than the original fragrances. And I think people who were fans of the originals just ended up buying new bottles of the originals rather than this special legacy line because of the huge price differential. Also in 2024, Flipo took a little step into niche, and she ended up making a fragrance for Essential Parfums, which is a fragrance brand that really, again, focuses on the art of the perfumer and just lets the perfumer choose what they want to develop. Of course, she chose to develop a neroli fragrance, a neroli orange blossom and petitgrain fragrance. This one was called Neroli Botanica. I did test out a lot of the Essential Parfums fragrances earlier this year, but I didn't actually get to try this one. So if you've tried Neroli Botanica, please do let me know how it smells. Also in 2024, Charlotte Tilbury were relaunching their fragrance lines, and they launched a series of 6 fragrances. I think Anne Flipo formulated 4 or 5 of the original fragrances. And really these fragrances seem to hit the market with a bang. There was a lot of PR flying around, and I actually bought a sample set of these fragrances and did review them. And I remember thinking that the more interesting one was the green one, which was one that Anne Flipo did not formulate. But I felt like the most likeable one, which is Joyphoria, was one that Anne Flipo did formulate. So what's Flipo been up to more recently? Well, I think the development of the Libre flankers all the time must be keeping her busy. But also she's made some moves towards the niche fragrance market. She's worked for BDK now, she made Nectar Oud, and she's also formulated the extrait version of 100 Silent Ways for Nishane. So far in 2026, we've had her launch a fragrance with Tom Ford. So Taormina Orange, which is an orange and lime citrus fragrance, supposedly inspired by a place in Sicily. Again, this fragrance features Flipo's beloved orange blossom. So looking back over Flipo's career, she has been an incredibly successful perfumer. She has been behind some of the world's biggest selling designer fragrances, and that has won her awards. So she has won, for example, the Prix François Coty in 2014. She also won the Prix de Parfum Marie Claire in 2015. And more latterly, in 2023, she received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Fragrance Foundation. When accepting that award, Flipo was quoted as saying, "My quest remains the same: signature, impact, pleasure." And she also gave a nod to the future generation. She said that her aim now is transmission. She says that going down in history is not important to her. She doesn't mind being forgotten, but she wants to pass her knowledge on to a new generation of perfumers. As part of her Lifetime Achievement Award, she was also asked which is her favourite creation. She said it was like asking someone to choose between their children as to which is their favourite. And she named really a selection of fragrances across her career for different reasons. So she said that she was incredibly proud of having worldwide blockbusters such as Vie Est Belle, such as Libre. She was also incredibly proud of working with Frederic Malle on Synthetic Nature. She said she loves the sensuality of L'Interdit, and she said she loves the countryside laid-back feel of Jo Malone's Basil and Neroli, as well as the immediate femininity of Paco Rabanne's Lady Million. And she mentioned a few more as well. She really couldn't choose. So Anne Flipo's back catalogue is so immense. I'm pretty sure I will have missed out several of her creations and probably some very important ones in this video. But if you have got a favourite fragrance from Anne Flipo, please do let me know it down below. And also just tell me your experiences with Anne Flipo fragrances in general. Have you tried any of the fragrances I've featured in this video? Of course, I've not mentioned her numerous flanker fragrances for so many of the lines that she's worked on. And also, if you have enjoyed this video, then please do press the like button and please also consider subscribing. I will leave the rest of the videos in the series down below in the description box in case you do want to check out more from this series. But thank you again, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.